Welcome to our season finale, Concerto for Two Pianos. Welcome to those of you who will be joining us in person here at the Coworker Center or wherever you might be tuning in for our live stream tomorrow night. And this concert on surface is a little bit eclectic. We have works by three composers: Mendelssohn, his Piano Concerto Number 1, and we move on to a piece by Brahms, otherwise known as Haydn variations or variations on a theme by Haydn. And then we close the concert. We move from sort of the German-speaking part of the world to France and finish out the concert with Concerto for Two Pianos by Poulenc. So it's sort of on surface, it's kind of like eclectic, wide-ranging program. The two piano concertos that sort of bookend the concert are separated by basically just about 100 years. The Mendelssohn Piano Concerto was written in 1831, and Poulenc Concerto for Two Pianos was written in 1932. And the Brahms, his work just happens to be from 1875, so it's sort of smack right in the middle. So in some ways, you can enjoy the sort of how the orchestral writing and musical language evolved during the course of those 100 years as well. The Brahms, we are of course playing the orchestral version of his Haydn variations, but he actually initially wrote this piece for two pianos. So there's that sort of interesting connection as well. Mendelssohn, as many of you know, was an outstanding prodigy as a composer. He was writing mature, accomplished, amazingly beautiful works in his early teens. This work that he wrote comes from his early 20s. He was 21 when he wrote it. He was a well-traveled composer, musician. He would famously spent some time in Scotland, and out of that he was inspired to write works like the Third Symphony, Scottish Symphony, works like Fingal's Cave, and then later on he actually spent some time in Italy, and out of that we know that he was inspired to write his Fourth Symphony, the Italian Symphony. And also this piano concerto came about around the same time as his Italy trip as well. Those of you who are perhaps more familiar with Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto, which we have performed here at the Coworker Center, it's one of the most popular violin concertos in the repertoire. There are some similarities that kind of show Mendelssohn's preoccupations or interest in kind of developing his own unique treatment of large form, multi-movement works. He would often do that by linking one movement to the next, whereas in the works from previous era, all of these multi-movement works, they will come to a strong, definite conclusion before moving on to the next movement. So between the movements, you might see the woodwind players on the stage swabbing their instruments. You know, I might grab my handkerchief and wipe off my sweat, and maybe some people might cough in the audience, although that's sort of a obviously pre-pandemic norm. Whereas Mendelssohn, and you can hear this in this concerto as well, some of the movements are linked, so they sort of connect from one movement seamlessly into the next movement. And he started playing with this sort of concept in a lot of his symphonies as well as in concertos, a lot of these multi-movement works. Another way that he wanted to bring about a sense of unity within a large-scale works would be he would bring back some of the themes that one might have heard in the first movement. Let's say the first movement of this particular piano concerto. There's a lyrical second theme that is introduced by the piano, and then it's taken up by the woodwinds of the orchestra. That theme actually returns towards the end of the third movement. So by sort of making a musical thematic connection across different movements, that was another way that these composers, like Mendelssohn, later on people like Wagner really, and Franz Liszt, Wagner, the later Romantics, really kind of take off on this idea. But Mendelssohn here is already sort of creating his own path by sort of making a musical unity throughout the work by using the same musical material that will be recurring in later parts of the work. So to kind of bring things around, sort of to a nice conclusion in the listener's mind as well as for us on stage. I mentioned briefly the woodwinds. One of the hallmarks of Mendelssohn's writing for orchestra, to me, is the sense of warmth that he gets, especially in his writing for the reeds. So on the stage, essentially, it's usually the second row of the woodwinds are a pair of clarinets and pair of bassoons, and together they can create this such warm tonal palette. And he would use this very often in a lot of his symphonies, where maybe they're used in a more soloistic way, but then there are times in which he would take the two pairs of these wind instruments and sort of set them against, for instance, in this case, as sort of the warm, you create these warm harmonies and melodic ideas to contrast against the piano solo, who might be playing busy figurations, almost in a roles reverse. So the woodwinds might have more the thematic idea, and the piano solo part might be more of an ornament. So the piano solo part might have all of these busy scales and arpeggios, just very fast notes. And on top of that, you have these very warm tone colors of the woodwinds sort of floating above it, playing the melodic ideas. So it's kind of interesting hallmark of Mendelssohn's writing. That also Brahms in later, few decades later, Brahms also featured a lot in his writing for orchestra as well. So hopefully maybe you can hear those connections as well. Playing the solo part for the Mendelssohn is a talented young pianist from Arizona, Jessica John, and she won the Arthur Fraser International Piano Competition in 2019, so 2 summers ago. And we have a annual partnership with this Southeastern Piano Festival, in which the grand prize winner, the first prize winner of the Arthur Fraser competition, returns to play an entire concerto with the orchestra at the main stage for the subscription program. So we were originally going to have Jessica come in the fall of 2020, but of course with the everything restructured for this season, I'm happy that we are able to collaborate on this piece to end the season. Basically, almost two years to the date that she won this competition. So this organically sort of grew into be a sort of official opening for this year's Southeastern Piano Festival. So by featuring one of the past winners of the Arthur Fraser competition winners, and then of course featuring at the end of the program Marina Lomozov and Joe Rackers, performing both of course, the artistic directors of the Southeastern Piano Festival, and together and individually one of our frequent collaborators here at the Koger Center stage, to have both of them play one of the staples of 2-piano concerto repertoire, and that is the Concerto for 2 Pianos by Poulenc. And so that closes the concert this evening. The Poulenc, as I mentioned, was written in 1932. Poulenc was he would often cite he had many interesting quotes about his influences, musical influences. He would often talk about his love of the music of Mozart or Bach, for instance. He said he was never really particularly a fan of the music of Beethoven. He said he personally couldn't stand the music of Wagner, which kind of makes sense if you listen to Poulenc's music. And he was part of the group of composers collective called Les Six, or the Six. We featured one of the other members of Les Six earlier in the season in March, when we performed the Harp Concertino by Taillefer. Poulenc was another member of this collective, and in this part of the early 30s, there was a frequent house concerts, salon concerts, if you would, that was sort of hosted and organized by one of the daughters of Isaac Singer, who was the inventor of the Singer sewing machine, lived in Paris, and was friends with all these musicians and artists. And she would often host these gatherings, performances, and so on. So one could find people like Fauré or Debussy. At one point, people could find, Stravinsky was sort of in that circle at one point as well. So that's sort of in the environment that Poulenc surrounded himself in, and so he was very adept at kind of working off of his favorite musical influences, which also included world music as well. In 1931, there was this big exposition in Paris in which Poulenc came in contact with gamelan music. And he just fell in love with how, in the traditional gamelan music, how the percussion is used, but almost drums are used in sort of a almost melodic way, which was new to him. So in this particular concerto, you will hear almost like a fun little duet between the drums in the back and the piano solos up front. So you can hear some of those influences. The middle movements, the work is also in 3 movements. The middle movement is called Larghetto, and it starts out, one could almost mistake the opening. It starts out simply unaccompanied, just played by Marina on the first piano. Sounds like it could have been written by Mozart. And then quickly sort of moves on into Poulenc's own musical world a little bit. For those of you who might not be familiar with his music, you might listen to some of his melodies, and there might be some of you might think his music in some ways sounds so familiar, or maybe by the end of the piece, because the way he manipulates a very singable or whistle. You can whistle his tunes. I mean, his music is just always full of these charming melodies, which is no exception in this concerto. So that could probably be the part of the reason why people might not be familiar with his music, but when you hear it, there's already a sense of familiarity because how immediately interesting and recognizable and memorable his melodies tended to be. I mentioned his love of music of Bach. For instance, in the first movement of this concerto, it's almost as though Poulenc took some of those toccatas that Bach would have wrote for the keyboard instruments, organ, for instance, or any other keyboard. This kind of sense of improvisatory, very fast running passages. Except in this case, instead of just having one piano do it, it sort of almost becomes like a dueling ideas. I don't want to say dueling pianos, but it is, in a sense, it is sort of dueling pianos. So in this concerto, not only do you have sort of this dichotomy between the solo piano and the orchestra, but you also have this two pianists. Sometimes they almost compete against each other, trying to sort of outdo each other. Sometimes it's almost like a chamber music just between the 2 pianos. And then the orchestra gets in on the action as well. So sometimes it is sort of the contrast between the 2 pianos in the orchestra, or sometimes it could be one of the pianists, one of the pianos doing the main idea and orchestra accompanying. Or there are times where basically it's sort of a big competition between the orchestra and the 2 pianos to see who can kind of win it out in a sense. So it's a fun piece, and it's sort of a perfect way to end this program, as well as to end our Philharmonic Live Series this season. Sandwiched in the middle is the work that features the orchestra, and it is the Haydn Variations by Brahms. It's ironic in a sense, because we either know this piece as the Haydn Variations or Variations on the Theme by Haydn. And that was certainly the original intent of Brahms. He had a very good friend who was a musicologist. and he brought this recently discovered work by Haydn. And it was basically a divertimento that was written for winds. And it was most likely that this was sort of, we use the word serenade a lot. This was probably originally, when this piece was written, it was probably intended to be performed outdoors by wind instruments. Sort of a form of a serenade, but it was called divertimento. It was multi-movements. The second movement had this chorale theme, otherwise known as St. Anthony's Chorale, and Brahms fell in love with this particular theme and decided to actually use that as a starting point for this new work. As I mentioned, it was originally written for 2 pianos, and then he orchestrated it as well. So why I say ironic, because now the scholars believe that the original work was probably not by Haydn. They don't know who wrote it, but it's sort of, all intensive purposes, Brahms thought it was by Haydn. So of course, Haydn, he credited Haydn for that. What's important here is seeing and hearing this beautiful theme that's presented, and he basically kind of utilizes the similar sounds that Haydn or whoever wrote the original used. So the oboes and the bassoons, horns are prominently featured. He adds the little plucking pizzicato bass line in the cellos and basses, but that's how the piece opens. Another reason I think this theme was attractive to Brahms is when we think of music, a lot of times from Mozart or Beethoven or so, sometimes less so in Beethoven, but definitely usually Haydn, Mozart, and so on. There is a certain length of phrase. It's sort of like a musical sentence. And usually things were written in 4-bar phrases. And sometimes, I think to this day, a lot of popular songs are written that way. Sort of a simple progression of 4-bar phrases or multiples of 4. So 4-bar phrase, 8-bar phrase, so on. What's unique about this theme is that it's a 2 sets of 5-bar phrases. And what's unique about Brahms and his writing is that he would often throw in these kind of odd-numbered phrases in his own work as well. So it sort of makes sense that Brahms was immediately gravitated towards this particular theme, the St. Anthony Chorale. So he presents the theme, and of course it's your classic theme and variations scheme of things. So in which a composer will present either an original theme or borrowed theme. In this case, it's a borrowed theme. This was a very popular practice in the 19th century. A lot of composers would take a famous aria from a very popular opera at the time and create sort of a virtuoso showcase for various instruments using that theme. And it's really a test of, usually was a test for these composers and the performers to show off their technical virtuosity and musical imagination through these themes and variations. The idea is that, so the variations, you want to still keep the reminiscence or the essence of the theme. So the theme itself is recognizable throughout the variations, but the idea or the challenge for each composer is what can you do in each variation that is unique. So here, that was Brahms's challenge. In this sense, this particular set of theme and variations it's more to do with variations not in terms of technical virtuosity per se, but it's more to do with colors, tone colors, different combinations of instruments that he could use. For instance, one of the variations uses a interesting color. It's created by the flute solo with the violas. So it becomes sort of a one instrument in a sense, this kind of combining flute and the violas together is kind of an interesting concept. But Brahms was more interested in sort of also exploring the variations in terms of the varying degrees of emotion that one can kind of get into in each of the variations. Some of them are very introspective. Some of them are very lyrical. Some of them are. There's one that is definitely more Romani music influenced, and Brahms had a long fascination with the musical tradition of the Romani music tradition, as you can hear, like in the Hungarian dances or the finale of his first piano quartet, for instance. So you will hear all of this. So there are a set of 8 variations, and they're very short, because the theme itself is short. So usually that's sort of a typical MO for these themes and variations. Is the variations tend to be quite short, and then ends in this grandiose finale, which is also, I mean, you can hear, of course, the original theme, but what's interesting about the finale is some people call this chaconne, some people call this passacaglia. Essentially, the beginning of the finale, you will hear the harmonic idea or the bass in the basses. Passacaglia or chaconne is essentially, it's almost like becomes a variation within a variation. It's sort of a cousin of theme and variation technique in which the bass line remains the same. Think of something like the 12-bar blues, or there are a lot of popular songs again that are that way. It's built on the same harmonic progression, and just repeats, and everything on top changes. And so that's what Brahms accomplishes. Again, that was a technique that he adored, that some people like Bach used in the Baroque era. So Brahms was very fascinated by this form. Famously in the finale of the Fourth Symphony of Brahms, also uses the similar technique. So you can kind of do a preview in a sense in the finale of this piece. So that's essentially the entire program. It's a little bit unusual this season. There are so many unusual things this season, as I think we can all agree with that. But with the different length of concerts without intermission, this is one of those programs that would not have been really possible in the normal, quote-unquote, normal concert setting, because we essentially have 3 works of what we think of medium length. Each work is between 18 to 20 minutes. And so usually, typical orchestral program might have some kind of opener, overture, and then, it could be 5 to 10 minutes or so. And you have the concerto slot, and some of them could be, depending on who wrote it, could easily be 30 minutes. Then you have an intermission, and you have something in the second half, a symphony, let's say, 4-movement symphony that might be 40 minutes or 35 or 40 minutes. Oftentimes, you don't find a program that consists of 3 works that are sort of equal length from each other. And this one kind of worked because we were kind of aiming at a 60-minute program without intermission. So to have sort of 3 works sort of back to back that are equal length of 18 to 20 minutes is kind of an interesting thing that we would not have been able to do in the usual traditional setup. So again, this is sort of the new thing that we could try out in this particular concert season. With this new format. So I hope you enjoy it. And in closing, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for joining us tonight from wherever you are, whether in person or from your home online, and also for joining us throughout the season. We were one of the less than half of the orchestras, about less than a third of the orchestras around the country that were able to have sort of in-person hybrid streaming live performances with large ensembles for this particular concert season. And we could not have done it without you and without your support and your tuning in, you're attending the concerts, and you're tuning in and being engaged through the chat and all of those things. So this was a special experience for myself, for our musicians, our staff as well. And so in closing, I'd like to thank you and have a great summer, everybody. And we look forward to seeing all of you both again in person and streaming when we kick off our season, the 21-22 season, this fall in October 2021. Thank you.